Hello and welcome to a video talking about all those darn blasted robots and aliens being trans or gay or just general queer representation. Grumbly. Yeah, I'm actually not that mad about it. I've got a few things that I want to take issue with. Okay, look, this is something that you might have noticed too, because I have to assume that I'm not the only person alive who sees things like this. And that is the way that oftentimes a character who is celebrated by people as being non-binary or gay or queer or transgender representation ends up being somebody who is either a robot or an alien, and is from a culture or a different world wherein those distinct queer identities do not exist in the same expected or restricted upon manner as they do with humans. And I wanted to make a video talking about some of these, talking about the way that they present and what they actually are in media, because they are not necessarily always representation in the way that we would think of it. And I also wanted to get into why that might be a problem and some ways that it could be addressed or fixed. Those are all things I'd like to do. You can let me by watching the video. Or you can just leave. That's also an option. I'd be sad though. So the ideal place, I think, to start here is by defining what having robots/aliens be queer is, and an important element to know about it is the difference between representation and allegory/metaphor. This is an essential way that I have explained this to people as why it's different, and let me illustrate this with some examples as well. See, representation is when a group of people are able to see themselves played in some kind of media or popular culture, where who they are is given a space to be visible and to engage with the nuances of their identity and character that the group might share. This is especially useful for minorities, because for a lot of people, the main connection to that minority towards gaining an understanding and an emotional depth of sympathy about the lives and struggles of that minority, the ability to see them as human, is dependent upon forming connections with them. And when they're unable to have those connections in real life with real people from that minority group, the next best thing is connecting with the forms that are seen in media. It allows for the mass humanization that might otherwise be difficult due to scarcity or sparsity, that's not a word, of that minority in certain regions or areas where they might suffer bigotry because of that inability for people to connect with that group as human. And if you want to find examples of it, they're all over this channel. I've got tons of examples of transgender representation, and that's what representation is. And yeah, what is it good for? A lot of things. Now, on the other side of this made-up spectrum that I'm using for this video essay to illustrate what I'm talking about here, this isn't like a definitive science, it's like social studies. We have allegory/metaphor. This is when a group of people are represented via a characterization in media or in popular culture that is not explicitly that group of people, and is instead based on the ideas around the identity of that group of people. Allegory and metaphor can also vary from intended, wherein the creator states how they wanted this fictional representation to be a stand-in for a certain group, and unintended, wherein the interpretation of them has come more from an audience standpoint of an unfortunate series of stereotypes and oftentimes bigoted links that are shared between that fictional group and the suspected group that they are a metaphor or allegory for. Such as with the Ferengians in Star Trek, or the goblins in Harry Potter with Jewish people in the real world. It's not always as clear-cut or as simple as it being a direct allegory in either intended or unintended manners, something that I do in the future have an example of and we will eventually get to. Now, this is all great and good, and I'm sure that right now you are so excited that you clicked on this video to watch a budget amateur video on English terms and media studies terms by somebody who failed an English degree but did succeed in a sociology and media studies degree. But how does this relate to me robots and me aliens in me fucking video games and TV shows, right, lad? And yes, that is a fair comment. It relates because a lot of times when people refer to robots or aliens as representation, as being this direct version of a transgender or non-binary human that you might have the chance of meeting at some point or already knowing, what they actually mean is that it's a transgender or non-binary allegory. that it's intended as being something relatable by people who share elements of that identity, but it's not a direct representation, or at least not one that shares the same history or connection or interpretation that are essential within that community and that perspective. I want to explore later on ideas of why this is done for good reasons, and also why it's done at all. But I want to make one thing very clear here before I get into those examples, which is that I am not saying here that I take problems or issues with all of these. I might have my problems with a few of the times that robots and aliens are used in this sort of manner, and what they say or what they connect with in regards to how that relates to non-binary or transgender identities. But there's nothing inherently wrong with robots or aliens being non-binary, or existing outside of the forms of gender that we as humans have had restricted upon us for millennia by a certain culture and religion that was all the rage for quite some time and still sort of is. In fact, it makes complete sense from a law perspective for robots and aliens to break that trend. Why would these aliens that don't have the same gender and sexual restrictions that we believe or perceive ourselves as having go around calling themselves man and woman? That'd be ridiculous. Of course they would use a more non-binary sense if they're perhaps, I don't know, walking slug people. It's sensical, but it's weird to have them be non-binary representation when the whole idea is that their culture is naturally not within a binary at all ever, so there's not really a shared connection there. But like I said, within all that, I hope you can already see why it's hard to call them representation, and not just a character who happens to be what we could consider non-binary or queer in our specific terminology, but not necessarily within their terminology within the law. And I'm also certain that you can think right now of your own examples of this in your head, and while I'm talking about the ones that I've selected, those ones are completely valid and also worth thinking about. I'm not doing all of them. I wanted to initially do this about every character I could find, but there were too many, so I had to sort of cut it down to just a couple because I don't want to make a 4-hour video on this. I just don't. Okay, enough stalling and covering my ass for one day. Let's get into the serious examples of what I'm talking about here. Now, the first one that leapt to mind was the initial impetus for me writing this entire video, and the one that has me thinking about this for probably a decade at this point, is in fact the one that is more universal, that is connected to a variety of groups and the sort of discussions it evokes, which is the Asari from the Mass Effect. From the Mass Effect? I'm going to leave that in. Now, there is a lot to say about these blue-skinned, all-female characters who breed by mind melding with people and can do it with anybody regardless of species or gender. You might see immediately the kind of allegorical connections that might exist, or the metaphorical connections that might appear with such a characterization, specifically in the way that it relates to sexuality as not being sex necessarily in this regards, and also the nature of queerness, as Liara is often held up as a bisexual icon due to the fact that she will sleep with both Malshep and Femshep. There's also interesting questions raised around gender and identity via the Asari, such as when you meet Liara's father, who takes umbrage with the way that humans have a poor language interpretation of these various Asari notions. And when you read the in-game description around the universal translators that everybody is using, and it's the reason why everybody can understand everybody else, you know, not all the aliens are talking in the English language, they're talking in the normal language, it's just translated for you. And it mentions how it condenses complex concepts into ones that we can get within our own language. Which makes you think about how many things that we are certain of from the game about the other species that are in fact completely different to their intended realities, and vice versa. What concepts about human life and human identity do the Turians or Solarians have wrong because of the translations they are using, transposing our words with their thousands of years of cultural heritage into a word that kind of maybe means the same thing in their language? It makes you realise that calling the Asari all women and their leaders matriarchs, and using father and mother for their parents, and also using our terms for sexuality for them, is as covered by the game, flawed and incomplete. We, the humans, think of them as being all female. But that's not necessarily true to what they think of themselves. And this idea of bisexuality would be redundant in a culture that is basically an amoeba's approach to the whole process. What I'm getting at here is in essence that I wanted to cover because I think it does illustrate that concept of representation versus metaphor/allegory, wherein the characters and the Asari as a whole are not representations of any of our human identities within the lore of the game itself, but outside of that, as ways in which we as an audience relate to this fiction, we can see elements and aspects of these minorities and these discussions around gender identity and sexuality that are reminiscent of the very discussions that happen with real people in real life. Another example on the more robot side, and another one that triggered this whole essay because I saw an article and I was annoyed by it, that declared the character to be a non-binary icon and great representation for us non-binary folks, and that is Janet from The Good Place. Now, Janet is renowned for their trademark statement, "not a girl," added at the end of any comment by another made towards the perceived gender of the character because of how they might look.
I don't want to lose you, girl.
I'm not a girl.
What has one thumb and wants to keep going? This not lady.
Girl.
Not a girl.
I think I love you too, girl.
I'm not a girl.
I hope you've forgiven me because I love you, girl.
Not a girl. Is something every person has gone through. Not a person.
Though later in the series that term becomes more loosely applied, and that response is more vaguely defended in regards to explicitly the way that Jason refers to them, their paramour in the afterlife, Janet says this specifically because they are not a girl. They are a supercomputer condensed into the form of a person. Someone with access to almost all the information of the universe, and the ability to process that information, and that while they might take on the appearance due to design, it doesn't actually define them. While this might, as we've mentioned many times, hold some relevance or weight to non-binary people who identify with that, and might serve as some kind of iconic reference point, that meme alone of "not a girl," serving as a pretty decent one for anybody who keeps getting incorrectly gendered, Janet does not represent a non-binary person. Instead, being a computer that then gains some form of independent sentience and free will after being murdered multiple times, enough so that they are capable of forming bonds and independent thought. As I said, none of this necessarily negates you from being able to identify parts of who you are with the way that they react to statements or to the gendering of others. But by the very virtue of what they are in the lore, they do not exist as representation of non-binary people, and were not intended to. But this brings me to the big point I want to make about this. And at this point you might be asking, well, hang on a second, are you not going to go off listing more examples? Because the answer is no, we've already covered this, pay attention, I'm not going to do it. I want to illustrate pieces of the spectrum that I have so far discussed, and I'm certain that you can think of characters or people that might fall into the same places or into adjacent places, but for now, I want to move on to what issue I take with this, and why I wanted to distinguish between representation and allegory at all for reference to the media that we as a queer community see ourselves placed in. And it should be clear for you at this point, I'm hoping, that this is not necessarily about how one is superior to the other. One is not automatically the better way to engage with ideas in whatever franchise it might be placed, and one does not guarantee that it is good or bad within the terms of how people relate to it. They fulfill different purposes, and are designed for different individuals. Representation is useful because it gives us a link to a community that directly engages with who they are, that specifically makes that distinction, whether it be gender or sexuality, making it a main part of their character in a way that it influences how they act or react to events. It oftentimes demands that the creator have to understand or incorporate real-world issues that we see with that identity into their work, and it also gives us an opportunity to improve representation via criticisms of it. People also don't have a way to hide from the fact of what it is, a common thing that people love to do when the representation is more vague, being obtuse about what it stands for, and trying to justify why it shouldn't be like that. For example, the queer representation in Adventure Time or Legend of Korra, both of which were pretty obvious for a while, but that were left just vague enough for the main run that bigots could act as if those women were not crushing on one another. Seriously, I'd advise reading the Korra comic books or watching the post-Adventure Time episodes that they released, the hour specials, because it makes it patently clear what the deal is. Another example of this would also be The Matrix and its trans allegory, something that is somewhat obvious and has also been somewhat defended by the directors and creators of this franchise, but that because it's not a trans representation as much as it's just a trans allegory, it's much easier to go, well, it's not obvious, is it though? And with that mentioned, on the other side of the scale, allegory and metaphor are a good way to introduce concepts to audiences that might otherwise be hostile or unable to accept them, via using characters that are not exactly that minority, but embody parts of them and arguments from within that community in a way that attempts to get across an idea of what they are and what they deal with. It's like a great starter conversation, a great way to put those kinds of characters in without them being threatening, much like how queer characters were allowed to exist in Hollywood as long as they were like cartoonish camp villains. There is a purpose behind doing it like that sometimes, and I do get that. It's helpful for getting people at least thinking about it, the ball rolling. And when it comes to robots and aliens, it makes sense that a lot of them would fall more into allegory and metaphor than into direct representation. Because from a cultural and from an identity aspect, what they represent is not the same as the queerness that we are engaging with as humans. We can compare it to that, but by virtue of the fact that aliens should be written as if they are a people who experience vastly different modes of existence and evolutionary developments to what we have, as well as cultural heritage and history, they are not going to be the same as humans. And for quite a few robots, their approach to gender is going to be a little different, coming at it from an angle where they have not got the thousands of years of cultural heritage, i.e. Western Christian dominance, echoing on their perspective. They have a perception of who they are that is going to be quite different to what we have, an outside view perhaps. Now, there are cases where the aliens and robots do cross over into representation of queer groups in a way that breaches that metaphor/allegory. Flack from Borderlands is a good example where a robot that does identify as non-binary specifically, using they-them pronouns and also wearing a non-binary pin at times. That's pretty clear. And the Orville contains one too. We're in a person within a society where all of them are male, as we understand it, and wherein females are given sexual reassignment to become male. Yet again, as we understand the concept, a large part of this is that difficulty with metaphor/allegory, wherein we as humans approach this idea with our own concept of morality, that giving surgery to a child is wrong, and that turning them from female to male is a cruel medical intervention that doesn't make any sense at all. Especially when that surgery is based on just eradicating a perceived weakness, because this society views females as not good enough. Though, then you look at our human history of performing unnecessary surgeries on intersex children to make them more similar to the normal ideas that we have of presenting gendered bodies in the binary, so humans haven't got much to judge for, am I right? Haha, fuck us. But this story develops across a series in the Orville, as one such individual within the Morven species is a female, and is given the reassignment surgery at birth, before then transitioning back later on in a future episode. Now, this is complex, because as we might note again, from a human perspective, that initial bit isn't necessarily a trans story. A person was assigned female at birth, before then being forced to be male because of cultural pressure, before then going back to that previous birth assignment. Or at least that's what a lot of people say about the series of episodes, that isn't really trans metaphor or transposition at all. But I disagree. Remember that we're not coming into this with a human perspective. Remember that we need to view this as how Morven society would view this. And in that case, she wasn't assigned female at birth, it was noticed that she was different, and then she was assigned male at birth by that society, that then enforced her body to match that expectation. Which is kind of what we do. We have a binary system that we think people should be. We just happen to base ours more on what those genitals they got though? What them the genitals they doing? And that assignment is one that she then proceeded to change to not accepting and ultimately went back on in the future, which is itself a trans thing to do in modern society. Going, I don't accept my birth assignment and I would like to be a different gender to that, is a transgender thing. That's a trans thing. The initial story perhaps isn't. It's more about how parents feel enforced to accept a gendered perspective on their child. The two Morven parents are basically spending the whole episode discussing whether they should or they shouldn't go along with that reassignment. And one of them doesn't want to do it because they don't think that it's valuable, they don't think it's worthwhile, or they don't agree with that assessment of having this enforced perspective and unitary, is that the one version of binary, onto their culture. Yet again, we view transitioning in human society so much in relation to our birth sex in human society that it's almost an implacable part of it. But for the Morven society, the one that she comes from, it doesn't have the same binary expectations. This character is transgender in the way that the Morvens would understand it, and so they are to us as well. Many trans people can see themselves reflected in that from a Morven perspective. And the episode where she goes through that decision represents transgender issues and transgender identity in a way that crosses from metaphor into representation. And the writers and the creators are clear about the intention behind that as well, if we needed more reasons to believe that that was what they were going for in the episode. And so we get to the part where I have to detail what my problem is. The problem point that I was working towards before I got a little distracted making another example. And that is, while I appreciate that both representation and metaphor can be good and can be bad, I wish that more often we could find non-binary representation and transgender representation that was not placed into the metaphor camp by its association with individuals whose cultural experience and history and connection to the human audience is strained by the fact that they are not human, that they are robots or aliens. Because that is an unfortunate situation of us realizing why it's easier for people to accept gender diversity and gender fluidity from those groups and not so much from humans. Because they are different after all. Those groups are from another planet, or they're machines in disguise that can turn into cars. There is not an expectation on them to fit a mold that that audience understands. But I don't like the way that non-binary icons, that movies and TVs assign non-binary roles to those outsiders who are inhuman by the very nature of the fact that they're not human. Because for a lot of people with a lot of subconscious bigotries, they would also very like to think of non-binary people or transgender people as not that human, as a form of humanity that is weird or wrong or alien. It reminds me a lot of how many robots are also used as metaphors for autistic people, which is another part of that majority perception of these groups in a light that doesn't cast them as just like you or me, but as strange, as, well, not exactly human, you know, they're sort of robotic or alien in the way that they represent to us. It embraces the outsider aspect of a community that is still, at the end of the day, very human. And I'm not saying that we need to replace all aliens and robots with queer humans, because that's not what I'm saying. And I think if you reached that conclusion, then you wanted to find it regardless of what I said here. Ultimately, robots and aliens are going to keep being allegory for identities that exist outside of our established binary systems by virtue of the fact that they get to exist outside of them due to being outside of them from the start. But at the same time, we need to work on increasing and improving our representations. From characters who are meant to be reflections of non-binary and queer individuals in a way that people can see them humanized, can see those identities as being normalized. Ultimately, I want to stop seeing who I am reflected in characters who are not like me. I'd like to be able to see people who are like me in my media. They're not just starting the conversation by virtue of their differences, but actually exist and present themselves as non-binary. I'd like to stop having my non-binary identity compared to being a robot or an alien. And also, on that earlier note, let's stop comparing autism to robots too while we're at it. An example of a show that does this is The Owl House, wherein it has a character who is non-binary by pure essence of who they are as a species, specifically the Collector, a star being from a group of magical, super powerful star beings whose gender is. But at the same time, it has Rain, a person from a society wherein people are often clearly assigned genders, but they use pronouns that don't associate a particular gender and identify as non-binary. They're also very sexy and play magical music. This show covers two bases, both of which are ones that anybody can connect with if they want to. A non-binary person can see their identity reflected in either of those individuals if they want, but it's great because it gives us a variety of characterization. And I guess that's all I'm asking for at the end of the day, is a variety of options to relate to and to see ourselves in. Both metaphor, allegory, and direct representation. We need all of them, and we need more of them. If you liked what you heard today, or understood what I was getting at, that's great, because sometimes I don't really remember what the thesis was, and I get a little lost in just talking about trans stuff. If you did, please consider giving a like, share, subscribe, comment, or run into a Hollywood office shouting, by God, watch this here video from the YouTubes. We should be doing more aliens and robots, and I reckon we can do them as more kind of queer, but not really, it's what the people want. Look at this video. If you really like what you saw, maybe consider checking out my Patreon and subscribing to that. Due to the volatile nature of YouTube, it's the best way to support this channel, and to ensure that I'm able to make the videos that I want to make. Right now, I'm currently working on a deal wherein if we hit $1,000 on there a month, I will finally acquiesce to doing a Q&A, something that I'm deathly afraid of engaging with. So isn't that fun? If you do, you get to have your name plastered on the screen, like all these individuals who are scrolling past you right now. Each one a valued and incredibly appreciated part of the creative process. The part of the process that lets me eat food and pay for electricity. It's also the part of the process that keeps me up thinking of script ideas because I know there are those who want to listen to them. Other than that, thank you for watching the video and I hope you have a great day.